See, there's a great amount of village democracy which was instituted in North Vietnam, and in fact has also been instituted in the anti-left-dominated areas of South Vietnam, which is something qualitatively different than anything that has existed in Asian societies before. And this exists simultaneously with, let me be quite clear, this exists simultaneously with a good deal of repression and certainly not civil liberties of the sort that we're used to.
Chomsky, one of the most libertarian constitutions in the history of the world was written by the Soviet Union.
I'm not talking about constitutions, I'm talking about
my point is, what kind of freedom is experienced by somebody in North Vietnam? The answer is that the freedom is perpetually insecure.
Oh, well, you don't know
for
that.
Reasons, well,
you see,
I
what
know
you
that Ho Chi Minh himself has wept over the occasional necessity to kill 40, 50,000 of his own
Not
countrymen.
the necessity, the occasional fact. But just one moment, though. What I was talking, very, not only sarcastic, but also wrong. And you see, it's very important to recognize, if you want to understand what communism means in Southeast Asia, to realize that along with many authoritarian and repressive practices, which I certainly don't condone, there is on the side a great deal of democratization. There's been a liberation of energies and involvement.
Utter nonsense, if I may say so.
I don't think you're right.
After all, the great paradigm of Red China, in which the AFL-CIO itself concedes to something in the neighborhood of 20 million victims on that particular, I'm talking, according to them. Perhaps I didn't ask you whether that was correct.
The AFL-CIO
they did have a commission out there.
No one has claimed the million people killed through Chinese communist purges. Absolutely no one.
Well,
no one serious, at least.
It was published in the New Leader.
Fine. Well, the New Leader, yes, of course, the New Leader might. I mean, but I'm talking about no
CIA plant.
Well, I said no one serious has. Take a look at the China Journal. Take a look at China Quarterly.
I consider this
to be serious. You see, I think you're missing the point, really, and I think it's an important point. See, I think in looking at China, one has to recognize a great deal of repressive practice, a great deal of authoritarianism, and one also has to recognize a great deal of spontaneous democratic structure of a sort which never existed in Asia before, and if you want to know the truth, to some extent doesn't even exist in our society. Now, these things exist side by side.
If you read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, you find out that there's an extraordinary democratic structure even inside concentration camps. But it seems to me that it's almost profane to make this observation.
I think it's profane to make that analogy, because I'm talking about true democracy in which...
I don't think so.
Look, in which people, the peasants who live in a village control the institutions of their lives. They control the
organization. If you want to get out, you bump into the Berlin Wall on either side of the...
There's no Berlin Wall in China.
There's the equivalent of a Berlin Wall. There's the sea, and there's starvation, there's concentration.
No, there's no... That's just the point. You see, starvation has been very largely overcome in China.
Yeah, because they have something like 94% of people working on agriculture. But I think Mr. Doxey has a question for you.
They also happen to have 2 bumper crops in the last 2 years.
Professor Chomsky, when you say, as you said about 30 minutes ago, that there's a relativity of truth between nations, would you classify...
Relativity of truth? I don't know.
Relativity of truth, you said, in the international scene.
I don't understand the comment. If I said it, I don't know what it means.
Well, would you call yourself a political... Would you call yourself a political relativist?
I don't understand the concept.
Well, put it this way. Do you believe in a natural law? In transcendental truth, let's say, fixing social union?
I think that there's something to the doctrine of natural law, but I think that that's much more abstract than anything we've been discussing here.
Well, but wouldn't that then justify the use of terror in, let's say, stopping a tenet of the natural law from being broken, or stopping, let's say, the ends from...
Let's bring it down to earth. I see, I'm, of course, opposed to terror. Any rational person is. But I think that if we're serious about the question of terror, serious about the question of violence, we have to recognize that that it is a tactical and hence moral matter. Incidentally, tactical issues are basically moral issues. They have to do with human consequences, and if we're interested in, let's say, diminishing the amount of violence in the world, it's at least arguable, and perhaps even sometimes true, that a terroristic act does diminish the amount of violence in the world. Hence, a person who is opposed to violence will not be opposed to that terroristic act.
What Ross does is exactly the same thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, and he happens to be wrong in the case in which he applies it.
No,
you see, these principles tell you very little about real cases.
No, but that's I must say, that's the one thing that bothers me more about what you've been saying than the way you write. That kind of language, that is the notion of a terroristic act which restricts consequent violence, is precisely what Rostow says in The View from the Seventh Floor, when after this whole analysis about the moral world, he says there's not a single place where we don't have major military might to support it.
I think that the real point here is that when you try to formulate general principles that will apply to arbitrary political affairs, you find that you can only make very vacuous and empty statements. See, if one wants to talk in perfect abstraction from any real situation about the justification for violence and terror, then you come up with platitudes and empty remarks and so on. The point is that, you know, there are no very general principles that apply to such circumstances, or if there are, no one has enunciated and formulated them. So what one really has to do is look at the concrete historical situation. Now, where I would disagree, maybe Rostow and I would agree at this level of abstraction on the use of violence to prevent less violence, greater violence. Where we would disagree is in our evaluation of what is happening in this concrete historical situation.
So therefore,
and that's where one's attention ought to...
So therefore you have no philosophical objection to the way in which Mr. Rostow states his case, merely to its applicability in existing circumstances.
No, I say at this level I might not. I don't know what he says
but
about
he wouldn't
that.
Other things.
But in other things I have very great difference. For example, Walt Rostow says that we should try to strengthen, that the great threat of China to us is that it will succeed and provide a model to other countries. And we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Is that why you kept him out of MIT?
I assure you that I had nothing to do with keeping him out of MIT. I'd be delighted to have him back. He's a great help to us when he's around.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chomsky. Thank you all.